Senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, and he joins us now to talk more about Russia's possible endgame. General, in your book, you seem to predict this invasion, that Putin would provoke a conflict to test NATO and to force the alliance's collapse. Is that Putin's intent, and is that what's unfolding here?
Catherine, that's certainly part of his objectives, and really what I read about in Battlegrounds, and I think is bearing out here, is that this is a man who's driven. He's driven by a sense of honor lost associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union after 1991, especially, and then an associated drive to restore Russia to national greatness, and of course he's aware of his lack of resources really to do that. I mean, Russia's economy is about the size of Italy's economy. And so his theory of victory is to drag everybody else down, right? And under the theory that he can be, so to speak, the last man standing. And to do that, he's engaged in a sustained campaign of aggression and subversion, back to 2007, denial of service attacks on Estonia, invasion of Georgia in 2008, meddling and attacking elections in Ukraine in 2004, where he sparked the Orange Revolution and strengthened the democratic movement and the nationalist identity of Ukraine. And so what he's done, I think, here fits that pattern. And if he succeeds here, which I don't think he will, Catherine, but if he succeeds here, this wouldn't be the end of it, right? He would continue his aggression in an effort to reestablish Russian control and influence over the former territories of the Soviet Union, and then to subvert NATO, to break apart the alliance, and to restore Russia to national greatness.
And so, Lieutenant General, you say you do not think he will succeed here. Can you elaborate on why that is? And also, if you think it is the case that he has much greater ambitions than just Ukraine, as a former national security advisor, what options would you be tabling with the president?
Well, Tanya, I think it's clear that he's taken on more than he can handle, and he did so, I think, in large measure because of wrong assumptions, probably believing his own propaganda. Remember, I think he decided probably to invade again Ukraine, to continue the invasion that he started with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014. He probably decided last August or September when he published this long sort of effort to manipulate history, this historical discourse of about 6,000 words on a warped history of Ukraine, and what he, I think, believed is what was in that paper, that long discourse, which was that the Ukrainians don't have a Ukrainian identity. Really, they've always been subordinate to Mother Russia, and of course none of that is true. And you're seeing that with the tremendous will demonstrated by the Ukrainian people. And then I think he thought with just a demonstration of military prowess that Ukrainians would collapse. I mean, these forces that he's arrayed, it sounds like a lot of numbers, Tanya, but if you look at the scale on the map and you look at the problem of trying to secure dense urban areas where people are willing to sacrifice and to take risks and to defend themselves, I think it's an insurmountable problem in terms of establishing control over those vast areas. And it's not to say that they won't make more progress. It's not to say that they won't inflict much more pain and suffering and loss on the Ukrainian people. But for him to think that he can control Ukraine, I think it's a pipe dream. And there are a lot of just practical limitations on what he can achieve with the forces he's arrayed. And by the way, Tanya, I think too what we're seeing is some real weaknesses in Russian forces, logistics, and even in their tactics and their competence, especially in close contact with Ukrainian defensive forces. They're not conducting effective reconnaissance. They're basically driving into these anti-armor ambushes, and I haven't seen really, even though my view of this is obviously imperfect, as all of ours is, their ability to conduct what we call combined arms operations, to integrate really the armored capabilities with infantry and with artillery, and to do so in a way that creates dilemmas for a defending enemy. It seems like they're really limited in what they can achieve. And by the way, I think because Putin waited till the Olympics was over, probably because his dear friend Xi Jinping asked him to, the ground is soft, and the maneuver options off-road are quite limited.
If Putin has miscalculated, let's take a step back. In military intelligence circles, we call it the 30,000-foot view. And let's just talk about the potential ripple effect of Ukraine. has a signal been sent to China in regards to Taiwan?
Absolutely. And so far, I think it's been a positive signal from our perspective. I think what Putin wanted more than anything was disunity. And I think if there's anything you have to give the Biden administration credit for, it's that they preserved unity. They preserved unity across the alliance and with the NATO alliance and with other European partners, especially in this very strong response that they've had in condemning these attacks, but the big shifts that have occurred that have allowed some of the more severe economic sanctions that have really had a huge impact on Germany. I think it's really important to note that the Chancellor of Germany comes from the SPD party, the Social Democrat Party, which has a long history of kind of a deep affinity for Russia, and I think an unnatural affinity for the Russians. And he's jettisoned that and has not only agreed to the more severe financial sanctions, but has also agreed to ship weapons across Germany and to allow the shipment of German origin weapons into Ukraine. It's a big shift in their policy. Hopefully, what's next, in addition to the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we have to remember is, what is just a great ATM machine, for Putin, and it was a great source of funding, like the hydrocarbon sector broadly, to fund his war machine. I mean, 59% of Russia's exports are hydrocarbons. So I think what needs to happen next are sanctions on hydrocarbons. And hopefully Germany's coming to that conclusion. Of course, they're already in a lot of pain because of some bad energy policy decisions they've made. But I think that, for the German people, I hope they appear with the demonstrations we've seen, like in Berlin and elsewhere, the pro-Ukrainian demonstration. I think that the German people are willing to take on a little bit more pain to help alleviate the pain and suffering of the Ukrainian people.
Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, thank you as always for your expertise.
Hey, thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Catherine. Great to be with you.